This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. Winter is quickly approaching, and it's time to cover our outdoor furniture, including this fountain. A fountain like this will require a cover that is cone-shaped. In this DIY tutorial video, we're going to show you how to cut the fabric to the right shape and size for your cone project, whether it be a fountain like this or something similar. We'll also be covering how to sew up this cone shape with a round top and a skirt along the bottom. Let's get started and show you how to make your own cone-shaped cover for whatever shape and size application you may have. The first step is taking measurements. At the top of our object that we want to cover, we need to take a circumference measurement. This fountain features a woman, and we could measure the head, but that's very small. So what I'm doing is determining what type of round top do I want. Looks like 17 inches would be about perfect here. At the bottom, we want to measure the circumference around the widest part. That would be the bath here. And here I'm using a soft tape measure and measuring around till I run into the part where I began measuring. Our measurement for this fountain is 106 inches. Next, measure from the top of your structure to where the bottom circumference measurement was taken. This is a sloping length measurement. For us, it's 40 inches. For our cone cover, we want a skirt, so we'll measure from the bottom edge of the circumference measurement to the ground. Ours is 19 inches. On paper, roughly draw the structure you're trying to cover and then write down each of these measurements. Now we'll take those measurements and enter them in a special calculator designed for cones. You'll notice we didn't have to do any patterning. That's because we're going to use Sailrite's fabric calculator to determine the correct shape and size to cut the cone. Visit the Sailrite website and scroll to the bottom. There you will find a link called Fabric Calculator. Click on that. Here you will find a calculator for a multiple of projects. We're going to click on cones. Following the illustration above, we will enter the calculations for the circumference at the top, the circumference at the bottom, and the height. You can enter the amount you desire for a seam or a hem in these fields. The calculator assumes you want a half-inch seam. The fabric we selected is 62 inches in width. We've entered that and hit the calculate button. Now we know the amount of material that's required for the cone, and a list of instructions, and a cut panel rendering below. Let's go over these instructions in detail. Now, before we start entering the measurements in the Sailrite Fabric Calculator, we must consider the type of project we are fabricating. For us, it's an outdoor cover, and with any outdoor cover, making it too tight will make it difficult to remove and install. So for any circumference measurement that was measured that's tight against the structure, like this one down here, we will add at least 1, maybe 2 inches of extra material at that location. So our measurement is 106, we're going to make it 107. The top circumference for our cone, we measured at 17 inches, and we measured it rather loosely at 17 inches, so I don't need to add any extra there, so I'm going to put 17 inches. But for the bottom circumference, I measured it right up against the structure, and I measured 106, so I'm going to add 1 inch to that, so 107. Now for the height, I measured at 40 inches. I don't need any extra fabric for the height there, so we're going to leave that at the original measurement of 40 inches. And we're using a 62-inch wide fabric. Hit the calculate button, and there are instructions. We've chosen to use a Top Gun fabric from Sailrite. We'll lay that on the floor. So I'm looking at my panel rendition here. This is the top left corner. So for us, this is the top left corner. And if we read the first line here, it says draw a line 0.44 inches down from the top of the fabric. This edge has already been cut straight, and the calculator says to draw a line 0.44 inches down from the top of the fabric. Yours may be different. This line is being drawn across the top of the fabric along the width of the fabric. Now the next line says to draw a line 0.5 inches down from the left side of the fabric. So here again I'm using the clear acrylic ruler to accomplish that
task.
We'll draw this line all the way down the running length of the fabric.
So this is the top margin line here, and this is the left margin line. So where they intersect, here is where we're going to start our measurements from. So this may seem complicated, but it's really not. If you just keep reading line from line down and follow those tasks, you're going to be able to do this easily. So we're going to move on to step A. Step A says, from the intersection of the two margin lines, measure across the width to the right. So this is the left, that would be the right, 27.05 inches, and then measure straight down from that point, 85.82 inches. So that's what we're going to do next. So from the intersection is basically from this line going this direction. So that's where I've placed my ruler. And then I measure over to the right, which is this way, 27.05. So I'll place a mark here. So now I need to measure directly down from this mark we placed here. So I use my clear acrylic ruler and put it on the top margin line, and then I can take a straight edge up against it. That way I know I'm perfectly perpendicular. So my straight edge doesn't go far enough, but I put this down so that it's perfectly in line with this. So I need to go down 85.82. So I'll place a mark here. So we're not going to draw the line down this, which is shown in red in the panel rendition. We're just going to place the marks there. You'll find that you won't really need this line. So the marks are all you need. That's what we've done. Now we're on to step B. Step B says, from the left side of the fabric at the margin intersection, that's where we drew this intersection, measure along the fabric width and beyond, if required, 47.56. And then measure straight down from that, 42.91, and place a mark. Now, if this measurement goes beyond your fabric, you'll need to place a mark on the floor or table if you're working on a table, and you can do that with tape. From the intersection over 47.56, right there. Then we measure straight down from this. So again, I'm going to use my clear acrylic ruler, place it along the top margin, and place my straight edge along it to make sure that it's perpendicular. 42.91 is right there on this side of the ruler. So after you place this mark, it's always a good idea to confirm that it's in the right spot. And if you remember right, from the intersection, it was 47.58 to this point. So it should be from the intersection line there, 47.58. So we will confirm that. And if it's right, then we can go with it. Yep, it's perfectly right, 47.58. So that's marks in the right spot. Okay, if we continue reading on, that we're still on point B here, this mark that we just made is called our pivot point. And from this pivot point, we'll draw an arc with a radius of 47.56 inches. So what I have is some waxed twine here. You can use string as well. And what I want to do is I want to tape, or if I weren't afraid of putting a hole in the floor, I'd use an awl, my string to this pivot point. So to do that, I'm going to tie a knot here, basically, so that when I tape the string, hopefully it won't move. So I'll tie a pretty big knot here. So you can see here I have a pretty big knot. That's going to be where my pivot point will be located. I'm going to measure the measurement that we need for our cone-shaped cover. For us, it was 47.5 something. I need to look it up again. 47.56, so basically a little bit more than 47 and a half. I'm going to take a marker and I'm going to mark the twine or the string at that location. I've cut the twine with about 5 or 6 inches of extra from the mark. And what I'll do is I'll tie a loop in this so that I can insert my marking pencil. I want to tie this loop right at that point that we marked on the twine. So now I'll insert my marking pencil and I will tighten it up so that that mark is right on the pencil. Nice thing about the wax twine is you can actually manipulate it pretty easily, as you can see I'm doing here, until I get it directly on that mark. Then I'll cinch it up. Now I'll take the end with the knot and place it on our pivot point, and you either use an awl or tape and tape it well. Now don't go light on the tape if you're using tape rather than an awl. Use a few strips. So now we stretch our string out to the point where we marked the top margin line, and then we draw our arc, trying to hold our pencil at the same angle as we do. And it might not be a bad idea to get a second helper and have them hold the string at the pivot point to make sure that the tape doesn't come loose, since we didn't use an awl. So as I come down to the bottom, this should intersect with the left margin line, and it intersects perfectly. And then hopefully it intersects with this mark, or comes very close. And it does. There's that mark. So we stop there. The next portion of B says, then draw an arc below this one with a radius of 48.06 inches, which is also shown in blue in the rendering below. So that means outside of this one that we just drew, it's a ½ inch difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a ruler here and measure a ½ inch beyond that and place a mark, which is right there. So a ½ inch from this mark. I'm going to move the ruler, and then I'm going to adjust my string, because I have plenty of string here, by not pulling on the tape, but by pulling on the knot until my pencil equals that. There, that's perfect. So now I'll repeat this exact same procedure. And this places a mark a ½ inch from the first one. Now this measurement will probably be different for you. It depends on the size of your cone. And if you don't have any seam allowances at all, or any allowances for this, you may not even have this. So we're right here at the edge of the fabric, which is perfect. And then we draw up this side as well. Now, when we get to this intersection here, we'll stop. So when we get to this, we'll just stop right there. We're now on step C, and C says from the left side of the fabric at the intersection of the two margins, measure across the width, which is this way, 40 inches for us, then measure straight down from that point, 36.1, and place a mark. That's what we'll do next. So here's 40. Now we measure straight down 36.1. So I'm going to use my clear acrylic ruler to make a perpendicular mark down to that point. So that should be straight. Right here. So I'm going to confirm that by placing my ruler on that, and it should be 40 inches. Which is a little bit off. So I'm going to move it to 40 inches, or to the left-hand margin, which is a ½ inch from the edge of our fabric, and then I'm going to move my mark to there, because evidently I wasn't totally perpendicular. So there is my mark, not here. So the calculator said this mark is the upper left-hand corner of a rectangle that measures 4.3 wide and 13.63 deep. So left-hand corner means here, so it's 4.3 wide, so I'm on 4.3, measure up, and then I measure deep, what is it, 13.63. So I'll put it on this and come down to 13.63, which just is just about there. So there's 13.63, and we'll do the same thing over here. So we just strike a line there. Now we have our rectangle. So this is our mark. This is the width, and this is the depth. The calculator says use the same pivot point as we did for the large arc and create a smaller arc within our rectangle with a radius of 7.56 inside the smaller rectangle, shown in green in the panel rendition. Now we've already measured from our existing pivot point. That's why we didn't remove it. And this is 7.56 to this bottom line, which is what you should have as well. So I'm going to mark that again with a marker, and I'm going to tie my pencil to that location. Okay, so now we have that done, and we draw this arc.
Our rectangle is slightly askew, so you will notice that the arc is not directly on one side. It should not cause any issues with the cone cover.
Now the next step is then draw an arc above this one with a radius of 7.06, which is a difference of a ½ inch. So this arc gets drawn above, which is this way. So now we're going to draw an arc a ½ inch, because that's the difference. So I'm going to measure from this arc to this one a ½ inch and strike a line, and then adjust my string to that new measurement. So now we'll draw this arc.
Unfortunately, I'm not holding my pencil in the exact same position as I draw this arc, so the thicknesses are different from one side to the other. But again, it won't be a big deal for your cover.
Step D, connect the arc ends with a straight line from mark to mark, shown in yellow. Then measure above this line 0.25 inches and strike another line. This line allows for seam allowance for the join tab. So from here, we put a straight edge, and then from our mark here, we put that straight edge. And then we draw a line. Okay, so extend the line out. I should have extended it here as well, all the way to the edge of the fabric. And then 0.25 from this line, we make another line. So I'm going to measure a ¼ inch beyond this, which is right there, barely anything. And we draw a line parallel to this one. And we do the same thing over here. I pretty much know what 0.25 looks like, so I'm just going to randomly put a line on there that's parallel. There we go. Now we cut it out on the outside lines all around. So when we cut here, we start here, and this is the outside line here. Please ignore the rectangle for cutting. If your cone has a top, it also says on the fabric calculator what to cut it to. The radius for us is 3.71. So I'm going to use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler and place an awl in this hole, but not push it through the floor. And I'm going to make it 3.75 because I don't have 3.71, but it's close enough, which is this hole.
We are drawing this circle in an area of scrap fabric.
That's the circle of our top. Using a wet rag will typically remove these marks depending on the fabric pencil that you use. This is Top Gun fabric and they come off very easily, so we don't need these anymore.
We'll cut the cone out and the circle with scissors. We will not show that.
Okay, we have our cone cut out and we also have a top. Now the calculator does not account for this top up here. If your top is large, you may need extra fabric. Now our project also has a skirt that comes down here and is going to be sewn on. Again, the calculator does not account for that. So if you have a skirt, you'll need to add extra fabric than what the calculator says. The calculator only allows for this piece, not that, and no skirt.
Joining the sides of the cone is next. In a future chapter, we'll show how to make the cone top and the skirt if required.
Okay, now we're going to use double-sided tape, seam stick for canvas, and we're going to baste along one of the edges, doesn't matter which. This is a Top Gun fabric. It has no right side or wrong side, so it doesn't matter which side you apply the basting tape to. If your fabric had a right side and wrong side, you would apply the double-sided tape to the right side or outside of the cover. We peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and now we will baste this side to that side. We just want to line up the sides. Nice thing about double-sided tape is that if you don't have it right, you can peel it up again and rebaste. I'll use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler and put my finger on the metal part so that I don't break the acrylic ruler part, and apply pressure to the fabric, which helps to baste it securely in place. The needle plate on the Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machine shows what a 1/2 inch is, 3/4 and 1 inch. We're going to take the deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide and place it on the 1/2 inch. This works like a fence on a table saw. Now my stitch is a 1/2 inch from the raw edge of the fabric. We're going to sew a straight stitch about 6 millimeters in length, doing some reversing at the beginning.
Please excuse the noise in the background. Someone is stapling an upholstery job using the Sailrite upholstery staple gun. To sew this top gun fabric, we're using V92 polyester thread available from Sailrite. We have a size number 20 needle in the sewing machine.
At the end, we'll do some reversing. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. Insert my arm all the way to the top and pull it out. Now the easiest thing is to just sew it like we did and turn it right side out and be done. But for a more secure stitch and probably a better looking job, you want to do a semi-flat felled seam, which means that the tail on the inside, this is a 1/2 inch, that tail. And what we're going to do is fold it over to one side and then stitch on the top side here. That's a semi-flat felled seam. The unfortunate thing about a semi-flat felled seam on a cone like this is that you have to force all this fabric in, starting at the large end and working to the small end, which we're going to show you how to do. So I could take it to the sewing machine and splay it apart as I'm sewing, but it's easier to take it to the table and splay it so that, and crease it well so that we're falling on that stitch that we just created. So I'm splaying it open, pulling left and right, and then I'll use a heavy object like the Sailrite Canvas patterning ruler and crease the fabric well. So it wants to fold in that position, so we don't have to concentrate as much on creating the semi-flat felled seam when we're trying to manipulate this cone into the sewing machine. So my tail is facing this direction. Doesn't really matter which way the tail goes for this kind of application. It does for other applications where water's going to be running across the seam, but the water's going to be running down the seam here, so it doesn't matter. My tail's on this side, so I'm going to sew my stitch on that side. Notice my fabric is splayed out and I don't have any extra layers underneath. You got to check that to make sure that you're not sewing through any part of the cover. So we'll start here at this side. I'm going to use my presser foot as a guide to keep it up against this splayed out stitch, or the first stitch I should say. Do some reversing as normal. I'm going to splay my fabric out as I go. It should fold nicely on that fold that we created on the table. I can feel that I'm not sewing through anything besides my fabric. You can feel where there might be extra fabric underneath with your hands, and I can feel the tail still in the right spot. Almost there. Everything's out of the way. As you can see, the white table underneath. A little bit of reversing. Our semi-flat felled seam is done.
Since this is a cover, we want to add a round top. We're going to show you how to do that next.
If your cone needs a top, in this situation it'll be a circle that goes on, you can scroll down after step D and you'll read that if a fabric circle will be attached to the top of the cone, its diameter with seam allowance will be 6.73 inches.
When we did our patterning, we already drew the circle. Now we're just cutting it out with scissors. By the way, the fabric calculator is a little bit more complex now. It actually shows the diameter and the radius.
So the circle goes on the inside. And we want to match up these edges, and we want to sew a 1/2 inch from the edges as we sew the circle in place. The Sailrite Ultrafeed has a 1/2 inch marked on the needle plate. So as I sew, I'm going to grab the circle and the barrel basically and line it up. And as you're sewing, if the circle or if the barrel needs moved, you need to move that so you can actually work with the flat piece in front of the sewing machine foot.
What I'm calling the barrel or the cone, I like to keep in a straight line. In other words, it's feeding straight to the presser foot. While the circle, I am lining up it with the edge of the cone as I sew. So I'm pulling the circle over to match it up.
I bury my needle when I move the fabric around. I'm going to roll my barrel so I'm working with a flat part again. Then when you get to the end, you can do some reversing, but I notice I'm a little bit off here. You can see it there, so I'm going to actually sew up to there and do some reversing. There we go. So our cone is wrong side out. We're going to flip it so it's right side out. Or turn it so it's right side out, I should say. So here's what the cone looks like. We do not put a top stitch on a cone like this. It's very difficult to do. So only one stitch like this. This is typical.
Our cover requires that a skirt be sewn around the perimeter of the cone. That's next.
The bottom of our cone needs a skirt. And the bottom circumference is 107 inches for us. So I'm going to make a skirt that is longer than 107 inches. In other words, a rectangular piece of fabric. I'll probably make it 117 to 120 inches long. And we know, according to the measurements we took, we need this skirt to be about 19 inches. So I'm going to add a 1/2 inch for seam allowance at the top, and I'm going to add 1 inch for seam allowance at the bottom. Because I don't want to use a lot of fabric, I'm going to do this from basically almost 1 yard of fabric. So I'm going to cut 3 strips and then sew them together to make the overall length of about 117 inches. So we're going to measure up 20.5 inches for us.
The Sailrite Cone Calculator does not account for the amount of material for this skirt. So you'll need to add that in the amount of material that you order.
Mark it in 2 spots so we can draw a straight line.
If you need a skirt, you can use this equation to figure the amount of fabric required. If you'd like to make one long strip, you can do so. It just takes more fabric. The leftover fabric that we have requires us to cut 3 strips.
Okay, we're starting with just 2 panels. We have several to sew together to make our length. I'm just matching up the raw edges, and we want to sew a 1/2 inch from the raw edge. I can use this as a guide.
This is a straight stitch that's about a 1/2 inch away from the raw edges of the fabric. We're going to create a semi-flat filled seam here as well.
Then what we'll do is we'll splay it open to create our semi-flat filled seam.
Since this seam will be vertical, no water will run into the seam, so it doesn't matter which side the tail is on when we sew the top stitch.
making sure I'm pulling it apart as I sew to make sure it's on that first stitch. Scrolling up the fabric makes it a lot easier to get it through the arm of the sewing machine without getting in the way.
That makes it much easier.
So now the point of the next panel is that outside surfaces must face each other. This is obviously the outside surface because there's a stitch here. So this will be the outside surface of this panel. And then we'll sew this together in the same manner. Okay, so here you can see the cone on top of my skirt. So the outside surfaces, this is the outside surface and this is the outside surface, are facing each other. The arm of the sewing machine is going to be here, so I put my cone on the top here. So we'll carry this over to the sewing machine and we will start sewing a few inches from the edge. We're going to leave this unsewn so that we can join it up before we sew all around the perimeter. So I'll basically start sewing anywhere in here. I'm not going to worry about this seam coming down. You can sew anywhere, start anywhere on the cone. And I'm not even going to do any reversing at the beginning because I'm going to sew over those stitches. So all we have to do is line up the edges as we sew around the perimeter. This is our first stitch of the semi-flat felled seam. My rectangles below, my cones on top. I believe it's easier to do this by having one hand on my rectangular piece down here and then one hand guiding the cone. And then you can guide both panels. See, I have control of the bottom panel and I have control of the top panel. Then when I stop, I'll reposition my hands and continue to sew until I get to the point where I need to stop again. My fabric has a curl in it, so I'll straighten out that curl and continue sewing. Make sure this fabric doesn't get sewn in the way. And you may need to roll the cone around as you're sewing this, because obviously you're sewing around a large circumference. And I'm letting the Sailrite Ultrafeed walking foot do the pulling. All I'm doing is the guiding of both panels as I sew them. That's the beauty of a walking foot sewing machine. Okay, we're almost to the point where we began sewing. This is our stitch that has to be sewn to this. But I want to get a little bit closer because it'll just make it easier for determining the right size. Okay, right about there. I'll do some reversing. Okay, we want to stop sewing, obviously a few inches from joining this up, so we can join this up first. Then we can continue to sew around there and secure it completely. Let's take it over to the table. Okay, these are the two ends that'll be sewn together, but obviously you can tell I have plenty of fabric. In fact, too much. So I'm going to chop this off so you don't see it. We didn't need to sew in any more panels. Now we have less fabric to work with. So everything's laying flat. I'm going to lay this on the table. I'm going to lift this panel up, and then I'm going to measure over a 1/2 inch because that's my seam allowance from the edge of this fabric, the one underneath. So there's my 1/2 inch. Okay, on that. That's where I'll stitch it. Okay, with this panel laying flat here and the 1/2 inch marked, I'm going to lay this one over the top with its edges lined up for the most part, and I can see where that 1/2 inch line is. I'm going to strike a line a 1/2 inch from there on this panel. Then I'm going to measure over a 1/2 inch from that and mark that, and this is going to be our cut where the arrow is. The idea is that when these are sewn together, they'll be sewn together right at that mark, which will give us perfect amount of fabric to complete the circumference. So now I'm using the clear acrylic ruler, which will give me a perfectly straight edge to the edge of the fabric, which I've already cut nice and straight. So right there, and I'll strike a line. Now when you cut this, be careful not to cut the panel underneath it. Now these will be sewn together like this. 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just to make things easier, I'm going to flip this panel up and put double-sided tape along the edge of it so I can just baste it in place. So I don't want to have to fight all the material and keeping this edge lined up as I sew it. Then I can join them together like this. There we go. Whoa, fabric got stuck on the table, so my stitch went off a little bit, but nobody's going to see the inside, so I'm just going to back it up and sew as though it's still a straight line. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. Okay, we're starting from the bottom edge of the skirt. There's a lot of fabric here to do this top stitch. And again, you don't have to have a top stitch like we discussed earlier. This just is a more secure, more professional way. All right. My needle's buried so I can manipulate my fabric to get it in front of me and in my lap. I'm going to splay it apart and sew. Splay it apart. Bury my needle. Splay it apart. I'm making sure that I'm sewing through my 1/2 inch tail on the underside. I can feel it. It's right here. And a little bit of reversing. There we go. Now we have to pull it out of the machine from backwards. Now we turn it wrong side out again. Back and forth to complete our circumference. Okay, so see how that comes out perfectly? There's no excess fabric from stitch to stitch.
We'll just close up that unsewn area. We're going to skip ahead here to the end part where we do some reversing.
When you get to the end, do some reversing. And if the reversing falls out of your into your seam allowance, no big deal. Nobody will ever see it. Now we turn it right side out. Okay, we're shoving the skirt underneath the arm of the sewing machine. Now this time we definitely want the tail to be facing up. Why? Because water is going to be coming down like this and we want it to be like a shingle on a roof. If the tail were facing down, let's get it to face down, and if we sewed our top stitch in the skirt like this, then water would go in here and possibly seep into the seam. So when you have water running, you always want the tail on the underside, a 1/2 inch tail, to be up. And you're sewing this top stitch on the upper panel, not the lower panel. Every other seam was horizontal, or I'm sorry, vertical. This is a horizontal seam, so this is important. We'll just start anywhere, and we'll do a little bit of reversing at the beginning. As we're sewing, we'll straighten out our fabric with our needle buried and splay our fabric apart, making sure our tail is facing up, and it is. Now we get to a certain point, I'm going to bury my needle, and you see all this excess fabric. I'm going to push it through the throat of the sewing machine so that I have a little bit more space to work without having to necessarily stop. And I'm also making sure that I'm not sewing through my cone. I can feel it under here. There's nothing here besides just these two panels of fabric. Whoa!
We will sew all the way around the circumference, and then when we reach our beginning point, we'll do some reversing. We will not show all of this. Let's move on. We'll be creating a hem at the bottom of our skirt, but if you don't have a skirt, you'd be adding this hem to the cone itself.
Okay, we're going to create a single hem on this project. We calculated for a 1-inch hem along the bottom edge. If you'd like to put a double hem, you can. Gives it more reinforcement. So we're putting double-sided tape around the entire perimeter on the inside surface so that we can easily create that 1-inch hem and then take it to the sewing machine and sew it. Okay, now we'll peel off the transfer paper and create that 1-inch hem. Does it have to be accurate? It's nice. I'm going to guess at it for the most part. If you want to measure it, you can. That looks like about a 1-inch hem. I'm going to go around the entire perimeter doing that. Canvas patterning ruler can help crease the fabric well and bond the double-sided tape to the fabric.
On our cone at the bottom edge, we had a 1/2 inch for seam allowance to join the skirt. But let's say that you had a hem on the bottom edge of the cone and no skirt. There you may want to add 1 inch for a hem rather than seam allowance. It just depends on the type of cone that you're making.
We're going to sew our stitch about a 1/4 inch from the raw edge, and I'm going to use the magnetic guide yet again, and we're going to start sewing right here on top of the seam and do reversing in that seam.
What I mean by raw edge is the inner edge of that 1-inch hem, so about a 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the
sew
fabric.
around. Try to grab the fabric, it's rather slippery. Okay, we're coming up to the part where we started sewing. I'm going to clip the tails off. And then we'll do reversing right on top of that again. And we're done.
Our cone cover for our fountain is now complete and ready to be installed. It will be a slightly tight fit, but a tight fit means less abrasion. However, if you wanted it to be a little bit easier to install, instead of adding just 1 inch around the bottom circumference, you can add 2. It's up to you. Coming up next is the full materials list and the tools that we used to make this cone-shaped cover. We use Top Gun fabric from Sailrite, which is a very heavy-duty cover fabric that is UV and water resistant, yet very abrasion resistant. Another great cover fabric is Top Notch 9, which is slightly lighter for easier storage. You can find hundreds of great outdoor cover fabrics at the Sailrite website. If you have any questions about the process of making a cone cover or what types of fabric to use or anything else, feel free to give us a call or email us. We're glad to help. For more tutorial videos that may be of interest to you, click on a link here. And as always, it's your loyal patronage to Sailrite that makes these free videos available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.